The clock ticked softly in the kitchen as Liam rinsed his coffee mug, the warm stream of water a soothing rhythm against the quiet. Outside, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the suburban street. He'd been here for 3 months now, and though the neighborhood seemed idyllic, it often felt too quiet, too still. He leaned against the counter, letting his gaze wander to the window. Across the yard, Jacob was mowing his lawn. The hum of the mower buzzed faintly, underscoring the hypnotic motion of his broad shoulders as he pushed the machine in measured strides. Liam couldn't explain why he watched, only that he always did. There was something about Jacob that drew him in, something magnetic. Maybe it was the easy confidence in the way he carried himself or the rugged lines of his face, or maybe it was the way Jacob occasionally glanced his way, his piercing blue eyes meeting Liam's with an intensity that made his breath catch. Today was no different. As Jacob stopped to wipe the sweat from his brow, their eyes met through the glass. Liam froze, his hand gripping the edge of the sink. Jacob's lips quirked into a small, almost knowing smile before he turned back to his work. Liam exhaled, his pulse quickening. He'd first met Jacob on his second day here. The man had shown up unannounced, offering to help move some furniture. Liam had been struck by his quiet charm, the way his deep voice seemed to vibrate in the air between them. They'd exchanged numbers that day, but apart from polite nods and the occasional text about packages left on porches, their interactions had been minimal. Still, Jacob lingered in his thoughts more than Liam cared to admit. Tonight, though, something felt different. The mower's hum ceased, and Liam watched as Jacob disappeared into his house. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, frowning at the unknown number. "Hey, it's Jacob. You busy? Thought I'd stop by." Liam stared at the text, his stomach twisting. He hadn't invited him, but the idea of saying no didn't cross his mind. "Sure," he typed back, his fingers hovering over the send button before hitting it. His heart raced as he moved to tidy the living room, the thought of Jacob standing at his door already filling the air with unspoken tension. The knock at the door came just as Liam was smoothing the throw pillow on the couch, his fingers lingering on the fabric as if trying to stall. He straightened quickly, his pulse a steady thrum in his ears. It wasn't like Jacob hadn't been over before. He'd brought a toolbox once to help fix a leaky faucet, staying just long enough to test it before leaving with a casual wave. But this felt different, though Liam couldn't put his finger on why. When he opened the door, Jacob stood on the porch, his presence filling the small space with an easy confidence. His dark jeans and fitted shirt hinted at the strength in his frame, and the faint scent of freshly cut grass clung to him. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Jacob said, his voice a low rumble that Liam felt more than heard. He was carrying a 6-pack of beer, the bottles clinking softly as he lifted them in a casual gesture. "Thought we could hang out for a bit." Liam stepped aside, his words catching in his throat before he managed a quiet, "Not at all." "Come in." Jacob's eyes scanned the room as he entered, his gaze lingering just a moment too long on Liam. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make Liam's skin prickle with awareness. He shut the door, suddenly hyper-conscious of the quiet house around them, the faint creak of the wood floors beneath their feet. "Nice place," Jacob said, setting the beer on the kitchen counter. "Feels like you've settled in." "Trying to," Liam replied, his voice tight. He busied himself grabbing 2 glasses, hoping the motion would steady his nerves. "Still getting used to how quiet it is around here." Jacob chuckled, a sound that seemed to ripple through the space. "It grows on you. Though I get it. My first year here, I thought I'd lose my mind without the city noise." Liam handed him a glass, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through him, though Jacob didn't seem to react. He tilted the bottle to pour, the amber liquid catching the light as it filled the glass. "What made you leave the city?" Liam asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Needed a change," Jacob said simply, his tone revealing little. He leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip before looking directly at Liam. What about you? What brought you here? Liam hesitated, unsure how much he wanted to reveal. Same, I guess. Wanted something quieter. Quieter, Jacob echoed, the word hanging between them. And is it everything you hoped for? Liam felt the weight of Jacob's gaze and found himself unable to look away. Not exactly, he admitted softly. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile, as if he understood something Liam wasn't ready to say out loud. Takes time, he said, pushing off the counter and moving to the couch. He sank into it, his body sprawling in a way that felt both casual and commanding. Come sit. Let's see what's on. Liam hesitated only a moment before following, perching on the edge of the couch while Jacob picked up the remote. They settled on a movie, something old and familiar that neither of them paid much attention to. The soft glow of the screen bathed the room in shadows, the low hum of the dialogue a background to the silence between them. Jacob stretched an arm along the back of the couch, his fingers just brushing Liam's shoulder. The touch was so light it could have been accidental, but Liam didn't move. He sat rigid, his pulse quickening with every passing second. The air between them felt charged, the unspoken tension thickening until it was almost suffocating. You always this tense? Jacob asked suddenly, his voice low and teasing. Liam turned to him, his heart hammering. What? Jacob's eyes gleamed with amusement. You're wound tighter than a spring, he said, shifting slightly closer. His hand dropped from the back of the couch, brushing against Liam's arm. Relax. I'm fine, Liam said quickly, though the words came out more defensive than he'd intended. Jacob's smile widened, but there was something else in his expression now. Something darker, more knowing. You sure? His hand lingered on Liam's arm, the warmth of his touch seeping through the fabric of Liam's shirt. You seem nervous. Liam swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. I'm not. Jacob didn't reply immediately. Instead, he let his fingers drift down Liam's arm, slow and deliberate. The movement sent a shiver through Liam, though he tried to suppress it. You're not a good liar, Jacob said softly, his voice dropping into a tone that made Liam's breath hitch. The movie played on, the flickering light casting shadows across Jacob's face. Liam wanted to look away, to break the moment, but he couldn't. His eyes were locked on Jacob's, and the intensity in them made his chest tighten. Liam started, but the words caught in his throat. Jacob's hand stilled, his fingers resting lightly on Liam's wrist. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. You can tell me to stop, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just say the word. Liam's mind raced. He should say it. He should push Jacob's hand away, stand up, create the distance he so desperately needed. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears as he felt Jacob's thumb brush gently over the sensitive skin of his wrist. The touch was electric, sending a surge of heat through him that he couldn't ignore. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow as he tried to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Fear, desire, confusion, they all tangled together, leaving him unable to think clearly. Liam, Jacob said, his voice soft but firm. Liam opened his eyes, meeting Jacob's gaze once more. The vulnerability he saw there was unexpected, disarming. It wasn't just confidence, it was something deeper, a question, an offering. Liam's chest tightened, and he knew in that moment that he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't take back, something that would change everything. And still, he didn't move. Jacob didn't move, his hand still lightly resting on Liam's wrist, a steady anchor in the charged air between them. The muted flicker of the television cast shifting shadows across his face, softening the sharp lines of his jaw, the deep set of his eyes. Liam could feel the heat radiating from Jacob, the closeness between them an invisible tether tightening with each passing second. You're thinking too much, Jacob said, his voice low, almost coaxing. His thumb moved in slow, lazy circles against Liam's skin, the motion subtle yet maddeningly deliberate. You don't always have to. You can just feel. Liam's breath caught, his chest tightening as the words settled over him. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the moment, but the weight of it kept him still. His gaze dropped to Jacob's hand, the roughness of his fingers stark against his own pale skin. That simple contrast held him captive, like a detail too vivid to ignore. "Jacob," Liam finally murmured, his voice barely audible. It wasn't a plea or a protest. It was something in between, something raw and uncertain. Jacob tilted his head, studying him with a softness that was somehow more dangerous than the confidence he had shown moments ago. "Do you want me to stop?" The question hung in the air, a thread holding them in delicate balance. Liam's lips parted, but no words came. He felt frozen, trapped not by fear, but by the sheer gravity of the moment. Jacob's gaze bore into him, and for the first time, Liam realized it wasn't just boldness in his eyes. It was vulnerability, a quiet, desperate need that mirrored something buried deep within himself. "I don't know," Liam admitted finally, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Jacob's expression softened further, and he leaned back slightly, giving Liam just enough space to breathe. "That's okay," he said, his hand slipping away from Liam's wrist. The absence of his touch was both a relief and an ache Liam hadn't expected. "I didn't mean," Liam started, but Jacob shook his head. "You don't have to explain," Jacob said gently. He picked up his beer, taking a slow sip before setting it down again. His movements were measured, deliberate, like he was grounding himself. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable. That's the last thing I'd ever want." Liam looked at him, the sincerity in Jacob's voice cutting through the haze in his mind. "You're not," he said quietly. "It's just a lot." Jacob smiled faintly, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. Just don't shut me out, okay?" Liam nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood what Jacob was asking, or what he was agreeing to. The room felt heavier now, the air thick with everything unsaid. He shifted in his seat, his knee brushing against Jacob's. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through him all the same. Jacob noticed, of course. He noticed everything. His gaze flicked to Liam's leg, then back up, his lips quirking in a small, knowing smile. "You feel that too, don't you?" he asked softly. Liam's stomach twisted. He didn't want to admit it, not out loud, but his silence was answer enough. Jacob's smile grew, but there was no mockery in it, only a quiet understanding that made Liam's chest tighten even further. "Liam," Jacob said, his tone shifting, growing deeper, more serious. He leaned in slightly, his presence overwhelming but not suffocating. "If you ever want to talk about it, really talk about it, I'm here. No pressure, no expectations, just me." Liam swallowed hard, his throat dry. The vulnerability in Jacob's voice was almost unbearable, a mirror held up to his own tangled emotions. "I don't know what I'm feeling," he said finally, the confession slipping out like a wound he couldn't hide. Jacob nodded, his expression never wavering. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to figure it out tonight, or tomorrow, or ever if you don't want to. But if you do—" He trailed off, letting the implication linger. The tension between them shifted, softening but not disappearing. Liam felt the weight of Jacob's words settle into his chest, the sincerity of them wrapping around him like a blanket. He wanted to say something, to reach out, to close the unbearable distance between them. But he couldn't. Not yet. Jacob seemed to sense it. He straightened, his movements slow and unhurried as he reached for the remote. "Let's finish the movie," he said, his voice light but not dismissive. Unless you've had enough of my terrible taste in action flicks. Liam blinked, startled by the sudden shift in tone. It took him a moment to process the words, but when he did, he let out a shaky laugh. I wasn't going to say anything, he said, the tension in his voice easing just slightly. Jacob chuckled, a deep, warm sound that sent a flutter through Liam's chest. You don't have to. I know what I like. They settled back into silence, the movie playing on, but the atmosphere between them was different now. The tension was still there, but it was quieter, less sharp. Liam found himself glancing at Jacob out of the corner of his eye, his gaze lingering on the curve of his jaw, the way the faint light from the screen danced across his skin. He didn't know how long they sat there, the minutes stretching into something that felt timeless. All he knew was that when Jacob finally stood to leave, the weight in his chest returned, sharper than before. I should go, Jacob said, his voice soft. He set his empty glass on the counter and turned back to Liam, his gaze lingering. Thanks for the beer. Liam nodded, his throat tight. Any time. Jacob smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He hesitated at the door, his hand on the knob, before turning back. Good night, Liam, he said, his voice low. Good night, Liam replied, the word sticking in his throat. The door clicked shut, and the silence in the house was deafening. Liam sat on the couch, staring at the empty space Jacob had just left, his thoughts a whirlwind. He didn't know what had just happened, what it meant, or what it would lead to. All he knew was that something had shifted, something he couldn't take back, and deep down, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Liam barely slept that night. The quiet of the house seemed louder than ever, the absence of Jacob a palpable void that stretched across the walls, the ceiling, and into his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the evening, Jacob's hand on his wrist, the way his voice had softened when he said, "Just let it happen," as if the weight of those words was meant to burrow deep into Liam's chest and settle there. He lay on his back, staring at the faint glow of the moonlight spilling through his curtains, trying to make sense of what he felt. Jacob's touch had awakened something in him, a restlessness, a gnawing ache that refused to be ignored. It wasn't just attraction. It was the way Jacob had looked at him, like he saw through the layers of fear and confusion, straight to the part of Liam that longed to be known. The next morning, Liam moved through his routine in a fog. He brewed coffee, stared blankly at his laptop, and tried to focus on work, but his mind kept circling back to Jacob. Every sound outside, the rumble of an engine, the distant bark of a dog, made his heart leap, as if he were waiting for Jacob to appear at his door again. By the time evening rolled around, the tension in his chest had built to an unbearable crescendo. He needed air. He needed to move, to clear his head, to escape the suffocating pull of thoughts he couldn't untangle. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he grabbed his keys and stepped outside. The warm summer air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and faint traces of barbecue smoke wafting from a nearby yard. He didn't have a destination in mind, but his feet seemed to know where to take him. Jacob's house was only a few steps away, its dark brick exterior bathed in the soft, amber glow of the porch light. Liam stopped at the edge of the driveway, his heart pounding as he stared at the door. What was he even doing here? He had no excuse, no plan, no idea what he would say if Jacob opened the door. But before he could talk himself out of it, the door swung open. Jacob stood there, barefoot and shirtless, a faint sheen of sweat on his chest as if he'd just come in from a workout. He froze when he saw Liam, his hand still on the doorknob, his brows lifting in surprise. "Liam," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of surprise and something else, something warmer, something that sent a shiver down Liam's spine. "Didn't expect to see you tonight." Liam faltered, suddenly hyper-aware of how ridiculous this must look. He hadn't even thought to come up with a reason for being there. "I was just walking, and I saw your light." Jacob's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "You've got terrible timing," he said, stepping back to let Liam in. "I was just about to take a shower." "Oh," Liam said, his face heating. He hesitated, glancing past Jacob into the house. "I can come back later." Jacob shook his head, already moving toward the kitchen. "Don't be ridiculous. You're here now." He grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water before leaning against the counter. "What's on your mind?" Liam swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He didn't know how to answer that. The truth felt too big, too raw to say out loud, but lying felt impossible under Jacob's steady gaze. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away from Liam. The closeness was overwhelming. The faint scent of his skin, a mix of soap and something musky, filling the air between them. "Liam," Jacob said softly, his voice so low it was almost a murmur. "Why are you really here?" Liam felt his chest tighten, his hands clenching at his sides as he fought to find the words. "I don't know," he repeated, though it was a lie this time. He knew. He just couldn't say it. Jacob's gaze flicked to Liam's hands, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're shaking." "I'm not." Liam stopped, realizing Jacob was right. His fingers trembled slightly, betraying the storm of emotions he was trying to suppress. "It's okay," Jacob said, his voice soothing. He reached out, his hand hovering just above Liam's, as if waiting for permission. "You don't have to say anything. Just let me." Liam hesitated, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. But he didn't move. He didn't pull away. Jacob's hand closed over his, warm and steady, grounding him in a way that made his knees feel weak. He stepped closer, his free hand brushing lightly against Liam's jaw, tilting his face up until their eyes met. Liam's breath caught. Jacob's gaze was heavy, searching, filled with a mixture of tenderness and restraint. "Tell me to stop," Jacob whispered, his voice rough with the effort it took to hold back. Liam couldn't speak. He couldn't think. All he could do was stare at Jacob, the world narrowing to the space between them, the heat of Jacob's hand on his skin, the way his thumb brushed against his cheek in a slow, deliberate motion. And then Jacob leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the boundaries of what Liam would allow. But when Liam didn't pull away, when he tilted his head just slightly, his lips parting in silent invitation, Jacob deepened it. His hand slid from Liam's jaw to the back of his neck, pulling him closer, while his other hand rested against Liam's hip, anchoring him. Liam's mind went blank. There was no room for thought, no space for doubt. There was only the warmth of Jacob's mouth, the press of his body, the way his touch sent sparks racing down Liam's spine. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to steady themselves. Jacob's hands didn't leave Liam's body, his fingers tracing slow, soothing circles against his skin. "I shouldn't have done that," Jacob said softly, though there was no regret in his voice, only a quiet, aching sincerity. "But I couldn't stop myself." Liam closed his eyes, his chest tightening as he tried to find the words for what he felt. But there were no words, only the steady thrum of his heart, the lingering heat of Jacob's touch, and the overwhelming certainty that nothing would ever be the same. Jacob's hands didn't move, his fingers still firm yet gentle on Liam's hip and neck, holding him in place as though afraid he might vanish if given even an inch. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ragged cadence of their breaths. Liam wanted to say something, but the words tangled in his throat, choked out by the storm of emotion surging inside him. His mind screamed at him to make sense of it, to put up walls, to establish distance, but his body betrayed him. Every nerve hummed where Jacob touched him, alive in a way that felt foreign and yet devastatingly right. "Liam." Jacob murmured, his voice so soft it felt like a thread pulling them even closer. His forehead still rested against Liam's, his lips barely brushing as he spoke. "If you want me to stop, tell me. I mean it." Liam's breath hitched. Jacob's proximity was intoxicating, his words grounding yet dizzying at once. Stop. He should have said it. He should have pulled back, put space between them before this thread snapped entirely. But instead, he heard himself whisper, "I don't know how to feel about this." Jacob exhaled a soft laugh, the sound warm and almost bittersweet. "That's okay," he said, his thumb stroking the back of Liam's neck with deliberate tenderness. "You don't have to know. Not tonight." The quiet assurance in Jacob's voice unraveled something inside Liam. It wasn't a demand, wasn't even a request. It was an offering, and it was too much, yet somehow not enough. Jacob leaned back slightly, his hand sliding from Liam's neck to his shoulder. "Look at me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Liam hesitated before lifting his gaze, his eyes locking with Jacob's. The intensity there was overwhelming, an open, unguarded vulnerability that made Liam's pulse stutter. He wanted to drown in it, and that terrified him. "You're not alone in this," Jacob said, his voice low, steady. "Whatever you're feeling, I feel it too." The confession hit Liam like a punch, stealing the breath from his lungs. Jacob had stripped away the last veneer of safety, laid everything bare, and left no room for doubt. Liam couldn't hide anymore. Not from Jacob, and certainly not from himself. "I don't know what I'm doing," Liam said, his voice trembling. "I've never—" He cut himself off, biting his lip as heat flushed his cheeks. Jacob's hand moved back to his jaw, his touch gentle as he tilted Liam's face slightly. "Neither have I," he admitted, his voice softer now. "Not like this." The admission left Liam reeling. Jacob's confidence had always seemed unshakable, but now, standing this close, Liam could see the cracks, the vulnerability beneath the surface that made Jacob feel painfully real. "I'm scared," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. Jacob's hand tightened just slightly, an anchoring pressure that steadied Liam in ways he couldn't explain. "Me too," Jacob said, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." Liam's chest tightened. The raw honesty in Jacob's words cut through his fear, leaving something else in its wake, something fragile but impossible to ignore. He leaned into Jacob's touch, letting his eyes flutter shut as he focused on the warmth of Jacob's skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I don't want to lose myself," Liam said finally, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "You won't," Jacob said, his voice firm. "Not with me." Liam opened his eyes, searching Jacob's face for any trace of insincerity, but there was none. Only quiet resolve and something deeper, something that made Liam's heart ache. He nodded, a small, uncertain gesture, but it was enough for Jacob. The older man's lips curved into a soft smile, his thumb brushing against Liam's cheek as he closed the distance between them once more. The kiss was slower this time, less hesitant but just as consuming. Liam felt himself melt into it, his hands finding their way to Jacob's waist, clutching at the fabric of his jeans as if anchoring himself. The world around them dissolved into nothingness. There was no fear, no doubt, no hesitation, only the warmth of Jacob's body, the gentle pressure of his hands, the way their breaths mingled in the space between them. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob rested his forehead against Liam's, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on his back. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, though his legs felt like jelly and his heart threatened to burst from his chest. "Yeah," he said, the word shaky but honest. Jacob smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that made Liam's chest tighten. "Good." They stood there for a moment longer, their bodies pressed close as the reality of what had just happened settled over them. Liam didn't want to let go, didn't want to step back into the cold, uncertain world outside the small bubble they had created. But eventually, Jacob's hands slid from his back, and the distance between them returned. "I should let you go," Jacob said, though his voice betrayed his reluctance. Liam swallowed hard, his chest aching at the thought of walking away. But he nodded, knowing Jacob was right. "Okay." Jacob's hand lingered on Liam's arm, his fingers brushing lightly against his skin before pulling away. "I meant what I said," he added, his tone soft but steady. "You're not alone in this. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out." Liam nodded again, his throat too tight to speak. He turned toward the door, his legs feeling unsteady as he moved away from Jacob's warmth. When he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Jacob was watching him, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down Liam's spine. "Good night, Jacob," Liam said, his voice quiet but firm. "Good night, Liam," Jacob replied, a faint smile curving his lips. Liam stepped into the cool night air, his heart still pounding as he made his way home. The silence of the neighborhood felt oppressive now, the stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how to face the shift that had just taken place between him and Jacob. All he knew was that there was no turning back. Liam spent the next day in a haze, every moment punctuated by thoughts of Jacob. He moved through his routine on autopilot, the memory of their kiss lingering on his lips like a phantom touch. It wasn't just the physicality of it, it was the way Jacob had looked at him afterward, the quiet promise in his words that had burrowed deep into Liam's chest and refused to let go. By the time evening rolled around, Liam found himself standing at his window again, his gaze fixed on Jacob's house. The curtains were drawn, the porch light off, and yet Liam felt the weight of Jacob's presence as if he were standing right there, just beyond the glass. His phone sat heavy in his hand. Jacob's number pulled up, but unsent texts blinking back at him like questions he couldn't answer. Finally, as the quiet became unbearable, Liam typed out a single word. "Can I come over?" The response came almost immediately. Doors unlocked. Liam's stomach churned as he made his way across the yard, the cool evening air doing little to calm his nerves. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the knob. This was it, the point of no return. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jacob was waiting in the living room, leaning against the arm of the couch with a beer in his hand. He looked up as Liam entered, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp, watching Liam with an intensity that made his heart race. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," Jacob said, his voice low, carrying the faintest trace of a smile. "I wasn't sure either," Liam admitted, his throat dry. He closed the door behind him, his fingers lingering on the knob as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Jacob set the beer down and straightened, his gaze never leaving Liam. "You're here now. That's what matters." The air between them felt charged, the silence thick with unspoken words. Liam shifted on his feet, his nerves threatening to undo him, but Jacob took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to be nervous," Jacob said softly. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against Liam's arm. "You're safe with me." The words sent a shiver down Liam's spine. Safe. It wasn't something he'd realized he needed to hear, but now that he had, the knot in his chest loosened just slightly. He looked up at Jacob, their eyes locking, and for the first time, Liam let himself hold that gaze without flinching. "I don't know what I'm doing," Liam confessed, his voice trembling but honest. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile, his hand sliding down to take Liam's. "Neither do I," he said. "We don't have to know. We just have to feel our way through it." Liam nodded, his heart pounding as Jacob pulled him closer. The warmth of Jacob's body was intoxicating, grounding him even as it made his head spin. When Jacob leaned in, his breath ghosting against Liam's skin, Liam didn't pull away. The kiss that followed wasn't tentative this time. It was deeper, slower, filled with the kind of aching certainty that left no room for doubt. Jacob's hands slid to Liam's waist, holding him steady as their bodies pressed together. Liam felt himself relax into the touch, his own hands finding their way to Jacob's shoulders, gripping tightly as if afraid to let go. Time seemed to blur. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the heat of Jacob's touch, the quiet hum of their breaths, and the overwhelming connection between them. Jacob guided Liam to the couch, pulling him down into his lap with a gentleness that belied the urgency of his movements. "Liam," Jacob murmured, his voice rough with emotion. His hands framed Liam's face, his thumbs brushing over his cheeks in soft, grounding strokes. "I need to know you're okay." Liam nodded, his chest tight as he looked into Jacob's eyes. "I am," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I am." The reassurance seemed to steady Jacob as well. He kissed Liam again, slower this time, his touch tender but no less consuming. Liam let himself get lost in it, the rest of the world fading into nothingness as he clung to Jacob, their connection the only thing that mattered. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed close, their foreheads resting together as they caught their breath. Jacob's hands drifted to Liam's back, holding him close in a way that felt protective, almost reverent. "I don't know what this is," Liam said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't want it to stop." Jacob smiled, his lips brushing against Liam's temple in a feather-light touch. "It doesn't have to," he said. "Not if we don't want it to." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep into Liam's chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how they would navigate the tangled emotions and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Jacob tightened his hold on Liam, pulling him closer as they sat in the quiet of the house, the night stretching out before them like a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Liam felt at peace.